Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Understanding and Working with Hoarding Disorder, Helping the Person Behind the Diagnosis webinar. My name is Brandy Brooks, and aside from being the moderator this morning, I am a contract manager for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program, the sponsors of today's webinar. Before I introduce our presenter, Eileen Dacey, I would like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First, to join the video portion of the webinar, go to www.readytalk.com and click the green Join Meeting button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. On the next screen, enter the access code 624-5494. Second, to join the audio portion of today's webinar, please dial 303-248-0285 and enter access code 624-5494#. Third, should anyone experience any technical difficulties today with either the audio or video for this webinar, please dial 1-800-843-9166. Again, that's 1-800-843-9166. And a Ready Talk representative will be more than happy to help. Lastly, all telephone lines are muted except mine and Eileen's. So please use the chat function located in the left corner to type any questions you may have. Given the number of participants today, Eileen will do her very best to answer as many questions as possible as we go along and at the end of the webinar during the Q&A period. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, let me introduce our presenter this morning, Eileen Dacey. Eileen has her MSW and LCSW and is currently the Clinical Hoarding Specialist and Program Manager of the North Shore Center for Hoarding and Cluttering, or NSCHC. NSCHC is a clinically based program that provides support groups, individual and family counseling, peer support programs, crisis case management, case, town, task force consultations, and agency and community training. Eileen chairs the North Shore Hoarding Task Force, is a member of the Boston Hoarding Task Force and the Cape Ann Hoarding Task Force, and sits on the statewide steering committee on hoarding. So now that I've introduced Eileen, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to her. Eileen, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Brandy. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today for today's webinar. I'm really excited, especially with our focus on hoarding disorder. And I'll be discussing the topic of understanding and working with hoarding disorder, helping the person behind the diagnosis. So for today's webinar, I will provide an overview of what hoarding disorder is and how it is defined. I'll discuss prevalence, some common co-occurring illnesses, and characteristic traits. I'll also spend some time discussing the 3 E's, as I like to call them: empowerment, engagement, and empathy when working with individuals afflicted with hoarding disorder. We'll also go over some motivational factors when someone is contemplating changing behaviors. And also, I'll provide a brief overview of some harm reduction approaches you can begin to take with some clients that you're working with where hoarding is involved, by providing you with some resources and assessment tools. And of course, I'll define what harm reduction is. Then there will be ample opportunity for anyone to ask questions as well, and I welcome them along with any statements that come to mind. So please do not hesitate to ask questions. And I think some questions that I'm seeing from someone named Annie is asking if there will be a link to the recording for today's webinar. And now, Brandy, I believe that this will be archived and will be sent out to participants, or they'll have access to locate this archived webinar. Is that correct?
That is correct, Eileen. A few days after the webinar, I will send out a link to the archived materials, so people will be able to access.
Okay, great. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. I'd like to ask a question of all of the attendees. Have you or are you currently working on a case where hoarding is involved? Just would like to gather a sense of your understanding and experience with hoarding disorder. So the responses, the selections here are yes in a professional capacity, yes in a personal capacity, or no professionally or personally. Please select your response. And I'll give you a couple of moments to do so. So looks like we have 65 total responses, with the majority of people stating that they've worked with a case where hoarding is involved in a professional capacity. So that's interesting. Thank you for everyone who responded. Next, I'm curious to know what your perception is of hoarding disorder. What do you understand about hoarding disorder? What do you perceive about hoarding? And I'd like to ask another question. So there are many opinions about individuals who struggle with hoarding behaviors. Listed below, which one most clearly or closely mirrors your opinion? So the responses or options here are sad, would help but don't know how. Next is person is lazy, and this is just an excuse. The other one is, I think I might have a problem. It's a moral issue, person needs to change, or none of the above. I'll give you a couple of moments to select your response. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go to the results here. Okay. So a lot of people indicated none of the above, and then the second option was sad, won't help, would help but don't know how. I like to throw in the I think I might have a problem. I do several presentations throughout the state and other states here in New England, and oftentimes, sometimes attendees will come up to me afterwards and say, I think based on what you're showing, I think I have a problem myself. I struggle with letting go of things. So I just threw that in there just out of curiosity. Okay, so what is hoarding disorder? Hoarding disorder is a mental health diagnosis and was included in the DSM-5 in 2013. Now, the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is a relatively new mental health diagnosis, although it's been studied for a number of years. It used to be called compulsive hoarding, that some individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, might exhibit, which is rather subjective. But now it's its own distinct category that falls within the OCD-related spectrum. So here's just a snapshot of the DSM diagnostic criteria for hoarding disorder. So first, it's defined as that persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of its actual value to you or I. And it's also due to the strong urges to save items or distress and indecision associated with discarding or parting with those possessions. Secondly, the symptoms result in the accumulation of a large number of possessions that fill up and congest active living areas of the home to the point where sometimes it can create safety concerns or fire hazards. Okay? If these areas, and this is really important to know here, if these living areas are uncluttered, it's only due to the efforts of a third party. So that might be family members, friends, or other authorities that are helping keeping those areas free and clear and maintained. Third, symptoms cause such clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other forms of functioning. Okay. Now I want to really dissect and define what these different components are when looking at hoarding disorder. So the difficulty in discarding is that true reluctance to discard possessions, right, that have that perhaps little intrinsic value to you or I. And the beliefs for saving the items are much more intense, and there's a larger rigidity that's applied to a greater number of possessions. Any attempts to discard these possessions or part with those possessions can cause such substantial emotional distress. Additionally, there's the component of excessive clutter. Now, this is the most physical and visible component of hoarding disorder. Again, items can create such difficulty in using living areas, can spill over onto beds, chairs, tables, even clutter pathways, rendering them unusable. And in those severe cases where it can prohibit the ability to safely ambulate throughout the home. I'd like you to think about any of the folks that you're working with that may be older adults and the need to ambulate throughout the home with assistive walking devices. Now think for a moment, being able to use a walker throughout that home if pathways are congested, cluttered, or there aren't pathways at all. There is a true risk of falling for the individual as well, and also any avalanche risks as well, so things toppling over, falling over, and creating more safety concerns for the person. And lastly, there's another component here about excessive acquiring. So that is the need to compulsively purchase items, collect free items, even samples. I facilitate a number of support groups here at our Danvers location, and many of our group members, as soon as they walk in through our front doors, they'll go over to the reception area and perhaps grab a couple of flyers, bumper stickers, pens, things of that nature. And then when they go to the kitchenette, they might grab a couple of packets of sugar as well. And that's really just an impulsive way of collecting things. It's oftentimes not really recognized, and we'll talk about it during our group sessions as well. You might also see that individuals will start to rummage through trash bins, maybe collect free things that might be on the side of the road, you know, a mattress, piece of furniture, something of that nature. And also inheriting items, so gifts received, things that they've collected over the years from loved ones and family members and that they feel they can't part with, because then if you were to part with that item from your loved one, it might be considered disrespectful. And then there's also a distress related to overspending and perhaps even possible debt after excessively acquiring something. I notice in my practice, oftentimes individuals might feel extreme guilt after they've gone shopping or collecting items based on that debt, or they found that they didn't really need the item, or perhaps they already have that item at home, 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 of the same item, or they don't have a space to place it either. Okay? So there's a lot of similarities and differences between hoarding disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. Of the similarities, you're going to want to specify the level of insight that the person is demonstrating, meaning what awareness do they have into the problem that they're facing. So let's go through these different levels. So the individual might have good or fair insight. That means that there is an awareness that they do indeed have a problem. Also, there might be poor insight. So the person states that they do not have a problem despite evidence to the contrary. Or there might be absent insight. That's going to be more of those delusional or fixed beliefs that they do not have a problem, again, despite evidence to the contrary. And you have to specify if the person also struggles with excessive acquisition. So not everyone with hoarding disorder also struggles with excessively acquiring items, but roughly 85% of those people do. And again, it's defined as excessively buying, collecting items, even stealing items, which is far less common at roughly anywhere from 10 to 15%. Okay, so now I'd like to pause and just see if anyone has any questions. So do a couple of moments here for questions, and I'll read back some responses. I'm not seeing anything yet. And if we don't have a question, I will move on. Okay, I'll go ahead and oh, here we go. They're coming in. So Elizabeth states, I wonder about hoarding of unpaid bills, paper, and mail. Elizabeth, that's a really great question, and I will address this as we continue on with our slides. There's a particular slide where I'll talk about paperwork in general. Question by Allison. She's asking, how does someone initially address level of insight with the client? Another great question. It can be rather tricky, and so if somebody is demonstrating poor or absent insight, you're going to want to stay focused on evidence, right? So if there are some problems within the home, maybe structural damage, or there's safety concerns, fire hazards, I like to stay focused on addressing and talking about those particular concerns, and I will go through those towards the end of today's webinar. And a question by Dominique asks, excessive acquisition, can we get more detail? Okay, so let me go back a bit. So in terms of excessive acquisition, that's going to be where somebody is actively purchasing an item, collecting free items, even samples, rummaging through trash bins, gathering free things that might be on the side of the road. And the reason why this can be problematic is that it's impulsive. Oftentimes there's no space within the home to place those items. Perhaps there's little awareness that the individual already has the same item at home, or perhaps they didn't need it, and it can create that debt or even overspending, if you will. It can be really problematic because, and I talk about this in my practice with my clients who do struggle with this, about high-triggered locations. And what I mean by that are places that the person is identifying that every time they go into that store, they have to get something no matter what. Even if they didn't have money to purchase it, even if they didn't have a space to place the item once they got back home. So some examples I hear, maybe Savers, which is very common here in Massachusetts, or a consignment shop, or a thrift store, if you will. Some of my male clients, they state Home Depot or Lowe's. So those are just some examples. And Christina is asking, what about hoarding actual trash, rotting food, used toilet paper? Good question, Christina. You're actually ahead of me. I'm going to be talking about the differences between squalor and hoarding disorder, so I'll get to that in a moment. Just bear with me, okay? I'm going to move on to the next slide here, and I'm going to talk about the prevalence here. So why hoarding disorder? So according to research, hoarding disorder roughly affects anywhere from 3 to 6% of the U.S. population. This is a cross-cultural phenomenon. It does not just affect Americans alone. Yes, other countries also struggle with this. And hoarding disorder impacts individuals from all different socioeconomic statuses as well. So people that come from affluent communities, people that come from even more impoverished communities, it could impact anybody. I'd like you to think for a moment, what is 3 to 6% of the U.S. population? That's roughly 15 million people in the U.S. alone. So it can impact anywhere from 1 out of every 20 people, making this one of the most common mental health conditions, actually. However, scholars believe that this is an underrepresented figure of the actual amount, and this is mostly due to self-reporting. So not everybody is going to be so forthcoming that, hey, I have a problem, number one. Number two, most individuals with hoarding disorder might be struggling with this silently. They're not going to tell people that, hey, I struggle with this problem out of fear, out of shame and embarrassment. And what I mean by fear is that potential of perhaps being reported to their landlord, to housing authority, to Board of Health, for example. So there is an extreme risk. And there also might be that risk for the individual that someone's going to come in and remove the items, or do a full clean out, for example. And I'll get into in just a moment what I mean by clean outs. I want to refer to another question that just came up in the chat box by Angela, and she's asking, do you see excessive clutter and excessive acquisition together in the same client struggling with hoarding disorder, or are they seen as separate types of the disorder? Great question, Angela. I do see them both concurrently when I'm working with individuals. What I mean by specifying if the person struggles with excessive acquisition is that another component to the disorder that they're struggling with. Again, it is fairly common. There's a strong likelihood that they do, and if so, that's something that we would address in treatment. Okay, so now I'd like to ask you a question. What are some symptoms of depression? And I'll get to in a moment why I'm asking this question. So sadness, fatigue, is there chronic pain? Is there trouble moving forward? All of the above. Give everyone a couple of moments just to select your response. Okay. So out of everyone who responded, I had 71 people who responded. Actually, one person said sadness. Everyone else stated that it was all of the above. Now, I asked this question deliberately. Yes, in depression, it's not just the psychological component. There can be, especially in major depressive disorder, a physiological component as well, or several components such as fatigue, such as chronic pain. And leads me into my next slide. So the common comorbid or co-occurring mental illnesses associated with hoarding disorder major depressive disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, and generalized anxiety. I like to think that hoarding disorder and depression hold hands. And what I mean by that is that depression, if the depression is rather severe, that can impact one's ability to truly make progress. And on the flip side, thinking about the clutter and the distress associated with being preoccupied with the clutter can make someone feel even more depressed, if you will, okay? I'd like you to think for a moment, any of these particular mental health issues, if you combine that with hoarding disorder, what do you get? You're now making a complicated situation made even more complex. And how do these factors impact the individual in their steps to achieving success and making true progress within their home? So some other characteristics of hoarding disorder I want to share with everyone who's attending today. You might find, and this is very, very common, severe information processing, perception, attention span, categorization, and decision-making deficits. And what I mean by that, now this is really important to know here. Let me go ahead and place an arrow here, especially for decision-making and just general information processing, is if you were, now think for a moment, going to begin to categorize the books in, say, your office, for example, what sort of categories come to mind? Now, when I do these presentations, I hear from several folks that attend, and they say, well, I categorize my books based off of a couple of different things. So author, maybe subject or genre, publication date even, color, and size of the book. Okay, so those are 5 very distinct categories. Someone with hoarding disorder might find a book and say, okay, it's by this particular author. It's going to go in this pile. Now I have another book, and it's by the same author. However, it's a different subject. So it's going to go into a second pile. Now I've located the third book. This third book is by the same author, same subject, however, it has a different publication date. It's going to go in a third pile. You see where I'm going with this. Now I have a fourth book. It's by the same author, same subject, even same publication date, but it's a different size. So it's going to go in a fourth category. Lastly, I have my fifth book. It's by the same author, same subject, same publication date, same size, but it's a different color, so it goes into a fifth pile altogether. That's just one example, okay? Now I'd like you to think of all of the other things that might be in one's home and beginning to try to make decisions based off of where that individual believes the item might go, for example. Also, I want you to pay attention to the personality traits that are very common in hoarding disorder. So there's extreme perfectionism, and what I mean by that is that an individual might state, if they struggle with perfectionism, that I don't want to make a decision about this item because I might not meet my own standards for making that decision. Therefore, it's too overwhelming. I'm going to place it to the side, and I'm going to get to it at another time. And that other time might not actually occur. There's also a dependency on the possessions as well, and increased sensitivity to anxiety. You also want to pay attention to the mood of the person. Are they feeling depressed as well, their affect, and those comorbidities. Very common in hoarding disorder is that a person might have experienced trauma, loss, perceived loss, stressful life events, or something that might have occurred in their life that might have triggered the hoarding behaviors. Okay, and I'll continue on some more characteristics of hoarding disorder. So now there's some attachments or beliefs associated with the items. We all hold on to items based off of different reasons. So there might be an instrumental, intrinsic, or sentimental reason for holding on to the items, and I'm going to define those further in just a moment. And then beliefs about vulnerability. So I find that this is rather interesting for a lot of attendees that have attended other presentations, that hearing that sometimes the stuff can create safety and comfort for the person, even though perhaps it might appear chaotic to you. And very common is that it's a coping skill for a lot of individuals, having the stuff, and it can create a sense of control for the person. So if you were to tell the person that you're working with who has hoarding disorder that they need to get rid of their stuff, but that's their only means of coping, then what do? I mean, you're going to want to identify and locate other pleasurable things, alternative activities, or other means of coping in a more appropriate and positive manner. I mean, when we're thinking about excessive acquisition, what does it feel like when you go out and purchase something, right? Maybe that favored sweater that you've been eyeing at one of your favorite stores, and you've gone out and you've bought it, right? And maybe you feel really great afterwards, right? So it's just some things to think about. Even some beliefs about responsibility. So in hoarding disorder, it's very common that once you start sorting with somebody, they're going to be talking about waste and not wanting to be wasteful. So they might go through extreme measures to make sure that they've gone to recycle everything, or that they're shredding documents that they feel might reveal their identity, for example, right? Or they might not feel inclined to part with items in general because they don't want to be wasteful. And so for some folks that grew up in religious backgrounds, especially Catholicism, they might feel that they're sinning if they're wasting too many items, and that's called material scrupulosity, when there's the fixation that I can't sin, so therefore I can't waste, so I'm just going to hold on to the item. And also you might find lost opportunity. If I were to part with this item, I might miss out on a potential opportunity. I might need it one day. I might need it for a potential project. Who knows later down the line. But if I got rid of it, then I won't be able to complete my project. Okay. Then beliefs about memory, too. Very interesting. Common fear that people demonstrate that they do not want to make a mistake about the possessions. They do not want to lose the information. So therefore, they'd like to place things in sight. Typically, individuals with hoarding disorder will organize things spatially. And what I mean by that is they'll place things on flat surfaces instead of putting it away in drawers or in cabinets, for example, because there is that fear that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Okay, so some other things to note here. Hoarding can actually begin in adolescence. However, it is incredibly difficult to diagnose in young children. So why is that? Well, if you're thinking about a young child or an adolescent, perhaps they don't have a lot of autonomy, and there's a caretaker, a guardian, a parent involved imposing strict rules about how the child should maintain their space, their home, that they have to clean up. They don't have the funds to go out and purchase items, for example, okay? There are genetic factors associated with hoarding disorder. Many people with this condition state that they have a first-degree relative who also struggled with some form of a hoarding problem. In fact, roughly 3/4 of all individuals with hoarding disorder report that they had a parent who had a problem with hoarding. Hoarding behavior is often triggered by trauma, loss, perceived loss, stressful life events. You have to think about that predisposition to developing a mental condition as well. It roughly impacts more men than women, which I find a lot of people are very surprised by this. And the average age of treatment seekers is 55 years old. Now, why is that? Now you're thinking of lifespan, okay? So someone now has that opportunity where they've lived a full life, they've lived through many different memories, they've acquired different things throughout their lives, they've received gifts, things of that nature, okay? And in hoarding disorder, you're going to find higher IQ, higher education levels, and more creative than the average person. So I'm seeing a couple of questions. Let me just go ahead and respond to them. Angela asks, do you see excessive clutter and excessive, I'm sorry, I already read that one. Excuse me. Amy is asking, how do you know it's genetic? If parent was hoarding, couldn't that be a learned behavior instead? Great point, Amy. So there is a question in the field about the genetic factors or the learned behavior, right? If you're growing up in an environment where there is hoarding involved, is it likely then the offspring would then develop hoarding disorder? Not necessarily. Maybe, perhaps, that offspring will feel accustomed to living that way, that they don't know any other way of living. But there are many people that once they are adults and they've moved out, that they actually go in the opposite end of the spectrum. Maybe they become minimalists, if you will. And they say, oh, well, you know, I need help from my parent. I would never live that way. And it can cause a lot of friction. I'd like you to consider that it's not so much genetic or learned behavior. Sometimes it could be a mix of both, but that is a true debate in the field. And a question by Joan, is alcoholism associated with hoarding? No, not necessarily. I'm going to be talking about the differences between squalor and hoarding disorder later on, and that might come up in our conversation. So I hope I'll be able to answer your question better, Joan. But just because someone struggles with an alcohol use disorder doesn't mean that they have hoarding disorder. Sometimes it's a component, sometimes it's another comorbidity that the person is struggling with. Okay. So, categories for saving items. I told you I'd get back to this. These are the 4 main categories that we all save items based off of sentimental reasons. So that might be where there's a memory that's attached to that particular item. Instrumental reasons, right? There could be a potential future use, especially if the item's repaired, right, for a project, if you will. Intrinsic items, now this is based off of aesthetic values for saving the item, and security reasons as well. So that might be batteries, flashlights, candles, because you never know just in case. So I'd like you to think for a moment if you've ever held on to an item for sentimental reasons. Okay, many of us do. Okay, you're thinking about those antique family photos, family albums, things of that nature. Now, have you ever held on to something for an instrumental reason? You never know if you're going to need it in the future for a project or what have you. I'll give you an example. Each year, I do a bit of spring cleaning, and I go through my closets and I start to remove a lot of different articles of clothing, and I'll donate them. Well, in the upper left-hand corner of my bedroom closet is a folded up pair of my favorite skinny jeans. They're my favorite. They don't fit anymore. They used to fit. They might fit again one day. They're a good brand. It was a good bargain. I can remember when I got them. I'm not ready to let go of them just yet. So therefore, I'm going to fold them up again, and I'm going to put them back in the upper left-hand corner of my bedroom closet, and maybe I'll address it again next year. I'm sure many of you are perhaps chuckling to yourselves because you're identifying that perhaps that seems very familiar for you. Now, let me go down through the list. Have you ever held on to something for an intrinsic reason? Now, it might be a beautiful piece of artwork, a decoration, your Lennox plates that you never use but it's only for company, whenever that might be. Have you ever held on to items for security reasons? Batteries, flashlights, candles, especially considering all of the natural disasters that have occurred here in our country. Many of us that are living here in New England, you never know, you want to be prepared for a blizzard. It's important to know that we all save items for very similar reasons. The difference is that someone who has hoarding disorder, there is going to be more of an intensity and rigidity to holding on to those items, and there's going to be a larger number of items as well. So perhaps if you and I might have maybe a box of batteries, someone with hoarding disorder might have several boxes of batteries, just to kind of go through that just for a moment. Okay, so now let me pause again to see if anyone else has other questions that they'd like to bring to the table. I'll give a couple of moments for attendees to type in your questions, and I'll read them back. Okay, so I have a question here from Allison who's asking, is there an explanation as to why people start seeking treatment at 55? Good question. So these are individuals, that statistic is, let me go back to the slide just so everyone can see that. Okay, so these are people that are actively pursuing treatment. That they're the ones who are identifying that they do have a problem and they want to get help to support this particular problem. So perhaps they're getting older, right? And they're at the point when they're considering, this is very common in my practice, that I don't want to leave this behind for my loved ones, for example. So therefore, I want to start sorting through my belongings so that I'm not leaving a lot left behind should I pass later on in life, okay? So it's just more or less the stage that they're in. Additionally, we're finding more hoarding in older adults because of the number of providers that are in the home too. So is there a visiting nurse coming in, a case manager, in-home therapist, a protective service worker, things of that nature, because now people might perhaps discover that there's a problem, even if the resident isn't necessarily electing to say that, hey, I do have a problem. Maybe they're quote-unquote being discovered. Okay, question by Anne. She's asking, can you speak more about the higher IQ? Good question, Anne. It's just really more or less a statistic stating that on average, people with hoarding disorder tend to be highly intelligent. In fact, all of my clients, and I see a number of people here on the North Shore and throughout Massachusetts, are incredibly intelligent. They might have been retired engineers, lawyers. Most prevalent careers are teachers, attorneys, and social workers. Yikes, I'm in trouble. But no, they're just very intelligent, and what I mean by that is that intelligence certainly appears as we're sorting through the items, right? Well, I've been thinking about holding on to this because I could make something out of it. So let me give you a case example from someone I used to work with. She used to hold on to orange Gatorade bottle caps, and they were just scattered throughout the home. And perhaps to you or I, that might just look like trash, right? But she was holding on to them for a specific reason, and I started to ask her a little bit about them. And she said, oh, well, I'm holding on to these orange bottle caps because I'm going to make a dollhouse, and I'm going to donate that dollhouse to the nearby school so that all the school children can play with that dollhouse. I love dolls, and I remember when I was young, I loved doll houses, and I hope that I can pass that along to other children so that they can enjoy that in their very unsteady lives. So very creative, and that's just one example. Okay, Yvonne is asking, are people with hoarding disorder more likely to commit suicide? So I would say no, not on average, but if the person is also struggling with, say, major depressive disorder, for example. Now, when you're thinking about depression, sometimes for individuals, suicidal ideations do come up. Of course, I'm always assessing for safety. If I hear anything within our conversations that give me pause, I'm going to do a full suicide assessment and talk about intent and their plan, and even sit down and create a safety plan with the person. But I wouldn't say that there is a correlation. It just might be that perhaps one of their other comorbidities, whether it be major depressive disorder, bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorders, schizoaffective, I mean, maybe it comes up, but that's more case by case instead of just the norm. Okay, and I want to just kind of go back to, in thinking about suicidality, instead of using the term commit suicide, I mean, it's really about the language that we're using, perhaps passing by suicide or they've died by suicide, because the term commit can have a very negative connotation associated with it. Okay, Christina's asking, within our viewing group, we have encountered few to no male hoarders. Are men more likely to report hoarding, and could this be a region-related issue for us? I mean, this is quite common, Christina, from a lot of people that I've worked with out in the community, different agencies, et cetera. They're reporting that they're seeing more women than men. Even in my practice, I treat more women than men. I do have a couple of male clients. But it really, in terms of answering the question, are male participants more likely to report? In my experience, yes, at least for our group members. We do have quite a few male group participants. But I'd like you to think for a moment, say, if Board of Health were to get involved. So they're noticing, or they've received reports that items have now spilled on over to the yard, for example, right? And there's items out in the yard. Any of the cases where I've dealt with those types of scenarios that are involved, they are male. But I don't think that I've answered your question quite specifically. It's just something to kind of think about. Helen's asking, how does square footage of living space relate to excessive clutter and hoarding? So, very good question, Helen. I'd like you to think that this is a mental health disorder, okay? It doesn't matter how large the space is or not. I often hear from some of my clients if they've downsized, maybe they were living in a larger home and now they live in a one-bedroom apartment or in subsidized housing. Well, if I had more space, I wouldn't have the problem. The more you start to talk with people, you might find that they have a storage unit or a couple of storage units. And again, this can affect people from all different types of socioeconomic backgrounds. So we're finding even in large homes, this is still an issue because it is a mental health condition. It doesn't matter how much space you have. Yes, in a smaller space, it might appear more cluttered, right, than rather a larger space, but that's still a true component to hoarding disorder. Let me go ahead and move along. I do have a couple more questions, but I will get back to them in just a moment. So understanding some of the challenges of working with people who hoard, I'd hope that if you take away anything from today's webinar, you'll notice that I'm not using the term hoarder, and I do that rather deliberately. And I'd hope that you can refrain from using that term as well. I might state that it's someone who has hoarding disorder or is struggling with hoarding behavior or a hoarding problem, or it's someone who hoards. It's because I'd like to refrain from using the term hoarder because when you're using that term, it's highly stigmatized and you're identifying the person as the problem. We're all people with unique needs, right? And it's all in the language that you use, okay? Like, for example, instead of saying that somebody is an alcoholic or an addict, that can be very negative to say. It might be someone who's struggling with alcoholism or struggling with a substance use disorder, okay? So there's beliefs and emotions that are associated with, again, a number of objects. You need to think about beliefs about the self in relation to the world. So think for a moment about something that you've been intending on purchasing, and sometimes those items that you've purchased mean a different status for you, right? If I bought this, this means that maybe people will like me, for example, and that's rather common for a lot of our folks with excessive acquisition. Or if I'm holding on to something, I'll give you another case example. I have a client who holds on to yards and yards of yarn. He states that, well, you know, it's a great conversation starter. You know, he loves to embroider items, crochet, knit, and he'll often bring his knitting supplies with him to different places that he goes. He also comes to group. And, you know, people will then ask him about the fabric and ask him about the yarn and ask for tips. So it, of course, can create new connections for people in a lot of ways. Again, we're thinking about the vulnerabilities associated with hoarding disorder, so that loss to family history. So if I have items, articles of clothing, and they were from my mother, and my mother is now deceased, I'm going to hold on to them even though they don't fit, and even though I'm never going to use them, it serves as a reminder of my mother. And if I were to let go of those sweaters and of those articles of clothing, that means that I really have to say bye to my mom. And are you trying to tell me that it's time to say bye? And that's what I mean about that kind of loss, vulnerability, and even intensity in holding on to an item. Also want to consider any cognitive distortions, maladaptive thoughts, problematic thinking when it comes to holding on to items, or that indecisiveness in making a decision. So I can't let go of this item because something terrible will happen. So someone might say, I mean, that's typical in catastrophizing. So I can't let go of these batteries or of these cans of soup because you never know if a natural disaster is going to occur or if there's going to be a blizzard and I'm not going to have anything in my home. Okay? And you also want to consider the level of motivation that the person is demonstrating and willingness to want to engage as well. So I'm going to get into motivation in a moment. It's a couple slides away. Let me go ahead and move on here. To clarifications. So as you know now, hoarding is a mental health disorder. It's not a decision. It's not caused by laziness, a lack of standards, or a lack of responsibility. Clutter, again, is only a symptom of the problem, the most physical component of hoarding disorder that we can view, okay? There's often much more to the issue, and that's what I mean by only a symptom of the problem. I'd like you to imagine for a moment an iceberg, for example, and about 10 to 15% of the iceberg is above the surface, right? But the majority of the iceberg remains beneath the surface. Same thing with hoarding disorder. You're seeing the most physical component, that's the clutter within the home, but what's going on beneath the surface for the person? Is there a lot of trauma there? Is there a lot of loss? Is there extreme depression? Is there problematic thinking and beliefs and attachments associated with those items? And although I'm not going to be going into treatment for hoarding disorder today for this webinar, I just want to make sure that you at least have the very thorough takeaways of what hoarding disorder is and how it's defined. Here, I'd like to make a very careful distinction. Hoarding and squalor are not the same. Squalor is defined as that filthiness or degradation from neglect. Hoarding focuses more on the volume of clutter, not so much the cleanliness. And I know that you're probably thinking, well, Eileen, I've been in a lot of different homes where I know that it's hoarding. I'm seeing that there's that attachment. There's a lot of stuff. There's a huge volume of clutter, but there's also trash in there too. Holding on to different things, you might find in those different piles of items when you're talking with folks or even viewing around the home, that there's going to be items of mixed importance. And what I mean by that is there's going to be a pile of maybe some antique photos, a birth certificate, a death certificate that's also mixed in with some receipts and some junk mail, if you will, and gum wrappers and bottle caps. So you're going to find a lot of different things. And when I'm talking about squalor, squalor is mostly, trash. You're not going to see that much of any other possessions that the person might be attached to. So anytime you go into a home and you're trying to decipher what is the difference, I want you to think to yourselves, attachment. Is there attachment to the items regardless of their actual value to you or I, even if it looks like trash, like my example with the bottle caps? Is there an attachment? If you're speaking to somebody and it looks like a squalid condition and they say, oh, you can throw it all away, I don't care, throw it all away, and they actually mean it, they're not going back on it, they're saying, I just got incredibly overwhelmed and I can't keep up, I can't clean up, maybe they're struggling with other physical components, maybe there's other mental health issues, but they're saying just clean it up. And if you had someone come in and they cleaned everything up and you're not seeing a reoccurrence of more clutter and it's being maintained, that's going to be a strong indicator that it was just squalor and there wasn't a distress associated during the cleanup process. The person was quite fine with you getting rid of all of the quote-unquote trash. That's not hoarding disorder. Okay, let me look at some of the questions. I see quite a bit coming in. Okay. So Angela asks, do you have any suggestions on how to best provide support for transitioning older clients with hoarding disorder from their home into a long-term care facility? So really good question, Angela. And I have to say that I don't have a lot of experience in providing support to individuals that are transitioning. Typically when I get involved, they're already in the place that they're living in, whether it is a downsized home or it is a nursing home. I had a client who was living in a nursing facility where the hoarding disorder was rather prevalent. But I think that, my best advice is to probably engage in treatment beforehand and continue treatment once the person has transitioned. so that they're more accustomed to living in their new environment. What treatment typically focuses on with hoarding disorder is behavior modification and implementing skills and strategies. And that's typically demonstrated through sorting and discarding sessions. Okay. Susie asks, is it possible to get a copy of these slides? Yes, Susie. Brandy, our chairperson here, is going to provide a link and make sure that everyone has this information. It will be archived as well. Lauren asks, hi, I'm curious if there is a link between hoarding disorder and obesity or self-neglect. Not really obesity, although it can occur. Again, it's not the norm, but it's more of a case-by-case scenario. Sometimes that can be certainly a physical factor to maintaining a home and sorting items. Self-neglect, yes, there is somewhat of a link, especially if you are a mandated reporter and you're considering making an elder protective service report. That's going to be one of the things that you're probably looking for is self-neglect involved, and maybe the case would get screened in. Not quite sure. Catherine asks, can you address whether people with hoarding disorder are at a higher risk for suicide? Great question, Catherine. There's no clear link, according to the research, to suggest that people with hoarding disorder are more likely to contemplate suicide or actually complete a suicide, but it depends on perhaps, again, the other comorbidities. So if they're struggling with major depressive disorder, maybe that's a component where suicidal ideations are coming up as well. Okay, so let me continue on. Oh, Chrissy asks, are there examples given on the hoarding show accurate? Because these seem to show both hoarding and squalor. Great question. I'm kind of chuckling to myself because many people ask me, Eileen, what is your perception of the show Hoarders or Hoarding Buried Alive? And I say two different things, right? Or I like them for two different reasons, I guess you can say. I like the shows because they're raising awareness that this is an issue. But it is reality TV. They are selecting the most extreme cases. Okay, there was actually a case in Gloucester a couple of years ago where they reached out to the show Hoarders and to see if they could get some support. And the show stated that it wasn't quote-unquote crisis enough. They're going to find and show, again, because it's the most extreme cases where severe hoarding is quite prevalent, a mix of hoarding and a mix of squalor, and that's pretty common. But again, the distinction is that attachment. Okay, so even if it looks like just quote unquote trash to you or I, is there an attachment there? Well, I'm going to hold on to all of those empty milk gallons, for example, because there's still a potential use. I can use this for an art project, or I'm going to use it because I'm going to fill it up with a different liquid and I'm going to use it at another time. I hope that makes some sense. All right, let me move on just for time's sake. When you're working with somebody who struggles with hoarding disorder, I want you to focus on a couple of different points. That it should be about building trust and establishing rapport, okay? Taking the time to get to know the person, to understand a bit about their journey, and taking time not to talk about the stuff. Every initial assessment that I go on, I am not in there just saying, tell me about why you're holding on to this, tell me about this item. I'm asking the person about them. Your name, what are your interests, what do you like to do on your spare time? Tell me more about you. Tell me about your background, okay? And I'm getting and taking and reserving the time to really understand and engage that person to really develop rapport. Taking more of an empathetic approach, so hearing more about their story And really, what I mean by empathy, it's expressing curiosity, really, and taking time to hear them. You can't say that you really understand because, of course, you don't. Everyone has, even if perhaps you might have hoarding disorder, everyone has their own unique journey that they've been on, and you're working with somebody, you want to get to understand them. I always assure all of my clients that I like to take a non-judgmental stance when I'm working with them. And you really can't move forward without trust. So work on empowering the person. So empowerment really is defined as perhaps the person believes that they have new choices that they didn't have before, a new freedom that perhaps they didn't experience before. And of course, they might have always had those choices, but they didn't maybe see them. Empowerment is more about seeing. Increases self-confidence, courage, even motivation. And it gives the individual more of an opportunity to be an active participant in their treatment plan. So why is empathy important? One of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So true about all of us, right? We respond naturally to positive reinforcement and validation. It's really just part of our genetic makeup, typically. And so it's more about just getting to know them and allowing people to feel that they can trust you. Oftentimes when I'm seeing people for initial assessments, I might be the first person to come into their home in a number of years. I'm a stranger, right? The last thing I want to do is make someone feel uncomfortable. So next I want to talk about motivation, okay? I'd like you to think for a moment about a behavior that you've been contemplating about changing. Think about all of those New Year's resolutions, whatever they might be. Maybe you've been wanting to eat better, exercise, quit smoking, or decrease your caffeine intake. Well, have you been successful? If you weren't, how long did it take for you to try again? What about the first time you realized the negative consequences of those behaviors? Maybe you thought everything was going rather smoothly. Then you have your annual physical with your primary care physician, and you found that you have elevated cholesterol levels, and your doctor tells you that you need to eat better and exercise more regularly. Well, many of us here live in New England, and for me, by the time I get out of work, it's pitch black outside, it's cold, or it's snowed, or it's raining, and all I want to do is go home and snuggle next to my beagle and binge watch Netflix. It's important to know and recognize that behavior change takes time, and motivation to change varies. Relapse is incredibly common and should be normalized, because if it's not normalized and you're working with somebody who has hoarding disorder and they've kind of fallen off the rails, if you will, and they're incredibly down on themselves, they've been doing really well for so long and something interfered, okay? It could be a number of different things. Talking that this is important and let's just find a way to kind of get back on track, continue to sort, or let's look back at our goals. What are the short-term goals and long-term goals, if you will? So it leads me to my next point of stages of change, also known as the trans-theoretical model of change. This can be applied to any behavioral change, originally developed when thinking about substance abuse, okay? But it certainly applies when thinking about hoarding disorder. And so I'll go through these different points. So someone might be in a pre-contemplative state. So they have no intention of changing their behavior whatsoever. There's no awareness that there actually is a problem. When I'm noticing this from somebody, I'm going to focus more on just establishing rapport. There might be somebody in the contemplative stage. So there's an awareness that a problem actually exists, but perhaps they're ambivalent about making that change. For example, I don't want to live like this anymore. It's causing a lot of rifts between myself and my family members. I'm tired of stepping over things when I'm trying to get anywhere in my home, and I'm tired of not being able to have anyone come over. But, and they start to talk about some of the benefits or the pros to that particular behavior. Now there's preparation. So this is when somebody is now taking steps and there's an intent upon taking action. So what that might look like is perhaps they're reaching out and they're looking at a number of different resources. They're trying to get connected with a support group in their area or locate a therapist. And then there's the action stage. Someone is actively involved in treatment or attending meetings. They're sorting and in perhaps even maintaining that newly acquired behavior. This is a sustained change where the new behavior really replaces the old. And then we find the relapse stage as well. So falls it back into those old patterns of behavior. It's important to know that this is a non-linear model. There can be a lot of jumping back and forth. It doesn't necessarily have to go in order. Maybe someone has fallen into relapse and they go back to taking action, for example. They don't necessarily need to go back to pre-contemplation. So I'd like you to focus on internal motivation when you're working with someone who has hoarding disorder, okay? So what makes people motivated to change, especially when we're thinking about hoarding behaviors? Confidence is key, and the importance to them, too. If you're going into someone's home and you're saying you have to change because everybody else says that you have to change, that's not really going to make it a strong likelihood that the person is actually really willing to change on their own volition. Therefore, the behavior is going to sustain itself. Some factors influencing motivation: social supports. We've got to think about those protective factors and risk factors, other co-occurring illnesses, and the ability to tolerate the discomfort. So that goes back to the coping skills as well. So if they feel that this is too much, maybe they'll revert back to the only thing that they feel quite familiar with. So now I'd like to go through something called harm reduction, realizing the time as well, so I'm probably going to go through these slides rather quickly. I find that in providing this information today will probably only be helpful if I'm providing tactical skills. So that's why I'm going to be discussing something called harm reduction. Harm reduction is a set of pragmatic strategies designed to minimize, let me highlight that, minimize the harmful consequences of the high-risk behaviors. It does not focus on eliminating the behaviors altogether. It first emerged in the Netherlands in the 1970s as a response to some of the limitations, or many limitations, to traditional abstinence-only treatment for illicit drug users. Think of clean needle exchange programs. They're scattered throughout the states, especially here in Massachusetts, where you're providing clean syringes for people so that they can use them, right? And it's more of a public health standpoint, because if you're providing and supplying clean needles and you're collecting used needles in return, you're decreasing the risk on the community, for example, of spreading infectious diseases. You're decreasing the risk that somebody is going to share needles or you continue to use a dirty needle, for example. But it's not quite focused on changing the behavior whatsoever. Of course, in most clean needle exchange programs, there are resources there within the program that if the person is electing to engage in treatment or to start to work on modifying the behavior, they have access to do so. So by implementing this harm reduction approach, drug-related overdoses and deaths in the Netherlands decreased dramatically. So in terms of harm reduction, I want you to think about the level of insight that the person is demonstrating. This focuses on working to improve insight as a whole. And this goes back to one of the questions from our attendees. Allison was asking about insight. I typically use a harm reduction approach for my individuals where perhaps severe hoarding is involved, where I've received a referral from another agency, that person's facing pressure, for example, maybe eviction or possible condemnation. I'm going to take a full-on harm reduction approach, and I'll define that in just a moment. It focuses more on objective goals, it's less confrontational, and it involves the person from the start. So there's clear differences between harm reduction and treatment. Harm reduction is most likely going to be a fixed duration, okay? The individual's most likely perhaps not open to treatment. And harm reduction certainly has an end. Focusing on safety does not, though, okay? If the person, once we've created and solidified some of our goals, for example, maintaining pathways or maintaining that all egresses are clear, and the person states, you know, I'd like to continue to work with you, then perhaps we'd move into the treatment phase. The treatment goals is eliminating or minimizing some of the symptoms that and to decrease distress and impairment, and the person's more likely to be open to treatment. I'm not going to engage in somebody with treatment if they're not willing to work with me. I don't provide a mandated service. So again, how does this apply for hoarding? Is that people struggling with severe hoarding do not typically seek treatment, yet they still face severe risks, and they might have little awareness of the severity of the problem or the nature of the issue. So clutter can still interfere with basic functioning within someone's home, right? We're thinking about cooking, cleaning, ambulating throughout the home, even sleeping if the bed is cluttered or you can't get into the bedroom, right? There's still a strong likelihood of fire, fall risks, perhaps poor sanitation, because if plumbing, for example, needs to be repaired, but there's a fear of having repair workers come in because of that judgment and embarrassment and shame. Even possible pest infestations can occur as well. And there's still a threat to the person that lives in the home and to neighbors, either people who live in neighboring units or within the community. I'd like you to note that hoarding accounts for 24% of all preventable fire fatalities, because of the inability for somebody to perhaps get out of the home because there's blocked egresses and windows, or for somebody to come in and rescue or save the person because of the clutter. Fires spread quickly, especially when there's flammable things within the home and there's lots of clutter. So what about cleanouts? A lot of people in the community feel that perhaps this would be an appropriate alternative, if you will, all right? Just eliminate the problem, throw everything away, right? And just make someone throw the stuff away. This does not solve the problem. I'd really like to emphasize this here. It does not solve the problem. Oftentimes, once hoarding cases gain public notoriety, they're more likely to be severe. They require intensive, lengthy, and costly strategic planning and responses to those needs. And they're emotionally taxing for the homeowner, the community, and the resident. They're not sustainable and they're not effective. They yield the highest rate of recidivism of anywhere from 98 to 99%, because you're not addressing the behavior. You're eliminating the problem. If you were to work with somebody who struggles with an alcohol use disorder, and you told that person they need to get rid of all of their alcohol, or maybe you got rid of all the alcohol for them, does that solve the problem? Is that effective? No. Think prohibition and how effective that was. Does not solve the problem, okay? It still creates such a psychological impact for the resident. It can be incredibly traumatizing for the client, and that's tied into that recidivism too. where things can get progressively worse sometime afterwards, after the fact. So how can you apply harm reduction for hoarding? You should involve the individual from the very beginning of the process. You are going to work on developing objective, concrete goals and a plan to reduce the risks. Do not focus on just eliminating the risk entirely. Avoid any subjective, personal value-based goals, okay? And I'd like you to also pay attention to and remember self-determination. The person has capacity, they still have the right to engage in risky behaviors, even if the effects can be rather detrimental, even if there is a chance that the person is going to lose their housing and be evicted and perhaps become homeless, okay? Harm reduction assumes that the client can and will make their own decisions. It fosters a relatedness through that mutual respect and empathy, empowerment, which we went over earlier, through realistic goal setting. And motivation is enhanced through that trusting and supportive relationship. Now, I'd like you to look at, and I understand that this might be a little difficult to view on your screen. This is a harm reduction standardized objective tool that was developed by my program called the Uniform Inspection Checklist. It was actually developed by my predecessor, Marnie Matthews. And the purpose for creating this, it's developed off of uniform unit inspections, so unit inspection checklists that many housing authorities use throughout the state of Massachusetts, and it focuses on fire codes, safety, and focusing on perhaps minimizing any risk and enhancing any perhaps safety concerns or what have you. And it's broken up into 3 different parts. The first part are the primary harm reduction targets. So egresses, a front door should be able to open a full 90-degree angle, okay? Pathways should be at least 36 inches wide, clear, unobstructed, and continuous throughout the residence, okay? Smoke detectors should be unobstructed. A minimum of 1 window should be clear in each room as well. I bring this tool with me on every initial assessment that I go on. And I bring a copy for the client as well, and we go through the points together. And if someone says to me, well, Eileen, my door opens a little bit, right? I try to use visual and descriptive language, okay, that would need to open a full 90-degree angle just in case emergency services needed to get in. Think about those pathways. They should be at least 36 inches wide, free of debris, because what if a gurney needed to come in? Perhaps, God forbid, you fell, right? Or windows, for example. Well, my front door is open, I could just get out of my front door. Think fire. If there was a fire and it was blocking your only means of exit, that front door, and your only way of getting out or someone coming in was through the window, that's why it would need to be clear. Okay, I'd like you to kind of take a look at these links later on. These are just some additional assessment tools. You'll have access to download freely the Uniform Inspection Checklist, as well as the clutter image rating and the home's risk assessment as well when you're deciphering what to do with a hoarding scenario. This is an example of the clutter image rating, and it goes through room by room. It focuses more on the volume of stuff. It's not stating that every room needs to look like this, for example, and it's not a diagnostic tool either. However, it does suggest that anything from 4 to 9 is of clinical significance. So if you're using this in a home, I'd like you to imagine if you were to shake the room up and all of the contents of the room were to fall towards the center of the room, what would that room look like? Okay, so it's just another way of kind of using it. I'd like to show a brief video now, and just to give you a bit of a preamble here, this is based off of the show Hoarding Buried Alive. And this individual had an intervention, if you will, where friends and family were cleaning up everything, and they were being antagonistic towards this person. His name is Carrie. And the psychologist and professional organizer came in, and they implemented a harm reduction approach. I'd like you to take a look.
After a tumultuous attempt at cleaning out over 2 decades worth of hoarding just a month ago, licensed psychologist Dr. Rebecca Beaton and professional organizer Leslie Joselle have returned to ensure that Carrie is still making progress, and more importantly, going about it the right way.
I'm concerned that forcing Carrie to remove items will cause more trauma and even a life-threatening situation to Carrie. He's very fragile, and we need to make sure that we take very responsible care of his mental health.
In order to accomplish that, but also provide Carrie with a safe living environment, Dr. Beaton wants to implement a new tactic called harm reduction.
Well, you know, the main reason why we're here is we know this has been really stressful on you, and we want to reduce the amount of harm. What we need to do in here today, Carrie, is we're going to create a pathway, if that's okay with you, where you can get to the fire escape, and a pathway where you can get to the window.
Okay. All right.
How do you feel about that?
I feel good. I feel good.
Harm reduction is an approach to help someone live safely and comfortably, and perhaps not perfectly. They use it a lot with situations like intravenous drug users, where you provide the drug user with a clean needle if you can't get them to quit using the drug. It's a way of reducing harm in a situation if you can't completely solve the problem.
I think for Carrie, harm reduction is the only answer right now. You know, he's a lovely man. I want him to find his way and make his own decisions and feel good about himself and not equate himself with his stuff. I'm sorry, I know.
If I have to be honest with you, I have this terrible, you know, it's a mental disease. Can't snap out of it.
Awesome.
And if I'll be a liar to tell you I'm not still depressed, and my anxiety level is not high. And you know, at this point, I really don't care what people, you know, people think I could snap out of it. I'm trying. But I think I made a lot of progress considering what this apartment looked like and what this apartment looks like now. And I think 6 months from now, it'll even look better.
Bye, Carrie.
Good luck to you.
Yes. One step at a time.
Small steps. Our pleasure. It was so nice to meet you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. That's show business.
Okay. Clearly you didn't get the whole picture here, but it was just a snapshot. Carrie is an Elvis impersonator, and at the end he was connected to resources in his area and engaging in treatment. I'm not sure how he's doing, clearly, but this was just sort of an example of how to implement harm reduction based off of some of those points that are listed in the uniform inspection checklist. I do want to be mindful of time, so I'll go through. I have a couple more slides left here, so bear with me. When you're working with people, try to work smarter, not harder. So identifying specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals. So if you're saying to somebody, oh, you just need to clean this up, this is a mess, well, that's not quite specific. So utilizing those points within the uniform inspection checklist can serve to be quite effective and more successful because you're breaking things down according to very specific goals that are not personal or value-based, okay? They're more concrete. Additionally, it's almost about asking the right questions from the start. Again, engaging and motivating and focusing on the individual's strengths. I'd like you to try to ask these 2 particular questions. Now, these were adapted from the miracle question. First, you can ask, if you woke up tomorrow and your home was just the way you wanted it to be, how would your life be different? Following it up with this question, what is something that you want to do that you're currently not able to do because of the clutter in your home. This image was an image from a case that I worked on with my supervisor when I was interning here in the program, and this was the only clear pathway. Right in front of it was the front door. The elderly man who lived here had a mat that he would roll up and roll down and sleep right there in that pathway every night. There was clearly severe hoarding disorder here. There was some structural issues as well, but he elected to engage in treatment. He wanted the help as well. And after a course of 8 months, and we had heavy chore workers helping us as well, when we asked these questions first, he stated, "I'd like to entertain and I'd like to play the piano for my guests," that he used to be able to do that. We asked him, well, you know, what interfered with that? Do you still have the piano, things of that nature? And yes, the piano, although you can't see it in this image clearly, there was a baby grand piano in here. And with that time, with the heavy chore, we uncovered a grand piano, 2 other smaller wall-side pianos, a baby organ. But at the end of that time, he sat down and he played a song for us because we focused on what his goals were long-term, and also creating some short-term attainable goals along the process. And to my knowledge, he's still maintaining and he's doing well. He's no longer involved with us. So I think that it's important to note that sometimes it's about redefining our perception of what success is. Okay? Have we minimized the risk? Is it safe and functional for the resident? This image, after implementing harm reduction and engaging the person, you might be able to see his knee in the bottom right-hand corner. There are clear pathways that are at least 36 inches. The door, although you can't see it, opens a full 90-degree angle. And there's another pathway on the other side of this island where it's also 36 inches wide. There's a poster board right in front of the window that was removed. So the window was also accessible as well. I'd like to leave you today with some resources. So there's some links on here of different resources, including a link to the website of the agency I work for, the North Shore Center for Hoarding and Cluttering. There's Mass Housing, Hoarding Project, and the OCD Foundation. Also, there's some links for resources that you can use for your clients and for yourself. So these are 3 Facebook groups. They're closed groups. If you have a Facebook, your friends can't see you joining. But you can join the Hoarding Task Force Network, and this is a group for professionals. If they're looking to gain more insights, I'm one of the moderators on this group. We post articles, educational information. It's also an opportunity for people to ask questions, too. We have a number of members. We're now at about 1,700 people across the world, including Australia, that are here. But if you're looking, hey, I'm living in Newton, for example, do you know of a resource in this area? And people will likely respond and point you in that right direction. There's also some links for your clients as well. So the Clutter Movement individual support is something that you can refer some of the people you're working with if they're looking to obtain that peer mutual support from others. It's great. It's huge at motivating people as well. Sometimes we'll have individuals post early in the morning, hey, I'm feeling stuck. Does anyone have some tips? And it's astounding to see other members chime in and say, you got this, or try this, or talk with them about some other suggestions. And then there's the family group, too, and this is for family members and loved ones of individuals struggling with hoarding behaviors. And, of course, on all these 3 different links, we post articles and resources as well and are there to respond to questions and inquiries. So that concludes today's webinar. I know that we're 4 minutes over, but I do want to have an opportunity to also answer any other questions that people have been contemplating asking. Ansley asks, how does a person's hoarding disorder affect family dynamics? What have you personally heard from families with a person who hoards? Can isolation affect or aggravate one's hoarding? And how should a family member approach their relative with hoarding disorder to help them? I do have a lot of experience with this. I get cold calls from family members and loved ones all the time. I have a brother, or I have a mother, or a father, or whatever the relative is, who struggles with hoarding behavior. I don't know what to do. Every time I've tried to broach this with them, they get defensive. I run a family support group here. I facilitate a family support group, and it's for family members and loved ones of individuals struggling with hoarding behaviors. It focuses on increasing communication and setting appropriate boundaries for themselves, and that you can only be responsible for yourself. You can't be responsible for the actions of your loved one. It's developed off of the CRAFT model, which is used in treating substance abuse, because treatment for hoarding disorder and substance abuse are very similar. There's a lot of overlap, so you might have seen that in today's webinar. But I speak with people about perhaps talking about ways that they can broach it in a more effective way. So for example, perhaps starting with a positive statement and then identifying how it makes them feel, and then ending with a positive statement that I love you, I'm coming from a place of support, and I want to be here for you, right? When you do this, it bothers me because I want to spend more time with you, for example. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Amal. I thought that I apologize. He asked and stated, you didn't discuss papers and bills with hoarding. So, paperwork is the #1 hoarded item. And the reason for that, I'd like you to think for a moment, think mail. Mail comes in every day. And then you have to open up the envelope, you need to read through the letter, you need to make a decision about something. Sometimes it can be incredibly overwhelming for the person, and therefore they're not going to get to it and they'll place it to the side. That's just one example when we're talking about mail. You might also see newspaper, for example. Pay attention to dates if you can, because sometimes if you're seeing a lot of patterns, say someone's holding on to a lot of different things from 1974, for example. What happened in 1974? It's just an opportunity to ask a bit more. But paper is the #1 hoarded item in hoarding disorder, also clothing, and gifts. And what I mean by gifts is gifts that the person is intending on giving someone, but it doesn't actually leave the home. Okay, I think that might be it for questions. Other people are asking if this will be offered again. I think that Brandy can answer that question in further detail. I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and of course I can talk on and on about hoarding disorder, so I apologize for going a bit over time, but thank you for being here, and I appreciate being welcome to today's webinar as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Just to parrot Eileen, I'd just like to thank everyone as well for attending today's webinar, and thank you, Eileen, for agreeing to present. In addition, be on the lookout for emails from us. I will be sending up a follow-up email in a few days that will include a link to today's recorded webinar as well as the slides from today's presentation. Once you log off today, I'd ask that you complete a short survey just to give us some feedback about today's webinar, and then if you have any other suggestions for future webinars. And I hope that you've gained more knowledge about working with individuals with hoarding disorder. And again, I thank you all for participating. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.